Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks especially to the organizers and the other speakers. It's been a really great event so far, and looking forward to continue to learn with the last talk as well. What I want to do with my presentation, just very briefly, is try to zoom out a little bit to recontextualize some of the questions about data and culture from the broader conceptual frameworks that we've inherited, we continue to use from the history of philosophy and theory. So I'm hoping to give you a rough and ready sense of this framework. You probably have some familiarity with it. Some of it's already come up in different talks. And then ask, in particular, after the place of hope in relation to this framework, given the current relations that we have to data and culture. So focusing especially on, in that sense, the affective dimension. In this way, some issues that came up in Shannon and Mathern's talk about, especially in the Q&A, is it super pessimistic? Is it all going in a dark place? I think Zach's talk was also wondering about what is optimal in the optimization. Is it really quite not optimal? But a different talk, some things will come up with also the question of faith in the broad sense of belief in the absence of some kind of demonstrative proof, so the epistemic dimensions. Another talk which I would love to give, but fortunately other people are talking about these topics as well, would ask after the role of love or the conative dimension in the time of data culture. So the intimacy and care questions that Gabi was bringing up, and Esme also, but also questions about justice that Louise was just talking about too briefly, and that looking ahead to Jessica Marie Johnson's talk. So that's the ambit. Let's just jump right in though. So the overview, the plan, quickly just talk about, the title of the thing is Culture Data, so I want to talk a little bit quickly about senses of culture, history of philosophies of data, the idea of algorithm, algebra, and the relation to human powers in particular, a disciplinary home, the question of it for the study of algorithms, or things like algorithms, and then this idea of algorithms and artifice or production being governed by some imperative that we seem to have or find towards perfection. And then the question of the making of algorithms or the artificial productivity in relation to algorithms as itself an act of hope. So there could be a question mark at the end, but it seemed like maybe in the setup I would at least leave it indicative. Okay, so culture data, we've talked a little bit about this. What, from the longer historical point of view, do people think about when they say culture? So a classical view, I think, is that culture contrasts, not everything is culture, some things are not culture, because in the most main thing that's not culture is supposed to be nature. And so here is again, this is not supposed to be something that everyone believes in exactly, but there's a working background kind of set of distinctions that I think people have in mind when they talk about culture. So nature includes like inanimate objects and vegetative things and non-human animals, I guess. And then even parts of humanity, or human beings, we think of as the natural parts. Just again, all these things people have spent, especially the last century or two, trying to problematize. I don't want to ignore that, but I want to just ramp us up quickly to some terms and why people are talking some of the ways that they do. But then there's this middle thing, which is like the psychical powers, so thinking, willing, wanting, feeling, loving, all those kinds of things. And then there's this higher thing still, which often goes along with community, but it is doing something beyond just boring thinking and willing, and it's engaged in some higher something. So instead of just psychical things or psychological things, we'll call those spiritual, is the way that they've traditionally been described. Okay, so that's a classical view. An even older view that maybe is underneath the classical view is culture is related to cults or the cultus. And so what the orientation in that progression really is picking up on is this pointing of all being and existence towards the highest. And so what culture is the formation of community or everything, if you were powerful enough, to become perfect and point to the most perfect and go towards the absolute. So we use the term cult nowadays to mean when that goes wrong or something's bad, usually, but it's the same word family, it's the root. So what if it went good? What if it went well? Is culture itself in its self-understanding inherit that? And so here, we don't just have the divisions, but we have kind of orientation points. So what is mere nature-oriented? Maybe different kinds of states with living things, maybe it's just life and survival, reproduction, different kinds of that, maybe some kind of evolution, who knows. Or the psychological things are oriented. When we think, we're trying to get to the true. When we will, we're trying to will the good. When we make stuff, we're trying to make stuff that works. When we have feelings, maybe we're trying to get to satisfaction or happiness or pleasure, who knows what. But then there's this whole other higher order thing of culture when it's doing stuff, when we're doing stuff in the relation to culture. What are we trying to do? We're not just thinking, willing, we're not just hoping for this truth, that good thing, happiness here, this or that. We're at least this older model that is underneath the roots of culture, I think the conceptions of culture is we want everything good, every single thing done well. We want every truth in all systematic form in all of science and the explanation relations to it. We want everything that we can do, we want to have the power to do it. We want all power. And then the putting it all together and orienting ourselves to something that would include all that somehow. Maybe it's us, maybe it's something beyond. And then we talk about that as the religious or the holy. Again, cultist sense of cult. Okay, so what about data? Where is data in this picture? So is it in culture? Is it already in nature? How does it relate to the idea of cultus? As was coming up yesterday, the idea that data, datum, just in Latin, is a thing given, something given. So then we want to know, like, given to what? Is it just given to the universe or what? Maybe nature is a data in that sense. But we are thinking typically, at least to humans, and then what is it to be given? What is that opposed to? Well, the things that we do or make, those aren't given. Those are out of us somehow. And then the last one, why and for what purpose, of what value is this being given thing? And so that, again, points towards these orienting questions. Now, there is, this came up in Shannon's talk, I think, this idea of the DIKW pyramid that gets talked a lot about now in data science-ish practitioners. So that there's a low level that's data, and what it's for is to churn out information, which then gets organized in terms of knowledge, and then eventually you get wisdom, this is actually common in some ways, but Rajesh yesterday was saying something like, oh yeah, back in maybe way back in the dawn of the 1940s or 50s. So I mean, of course, this is really old and probably much older than Aristotle too. But his picture of the workings of the soul is pretty much that. So there's a level which is roughly natural, where we have sensing or aesthesis, and then we implement different kinds of powers of our mind to get basic kinds of cognition or information. And then we form those into what we might call knowledge, at least in the sense of a science of this, a science of that. And then the aim is not mere episteme, but Sophia, this kind of higher wisdom that would encompass all things. Again, jump ahead a century or two, but backwards from 1940, Immanuel Kant, another just perennial kind of high point in this background working conceptual framework. Same thing, we have a low-level intuition, sensory stuff, that leads to cognition, that gets formulated in science. But even science isn't the highest. We should really be hoping for having science for the sake of something higher, namely wisdom. Okay, now just a small point. They also, and this doesn't come up in data science much, think of other kinds of data, not just sensory data or data that would lead to theoretical information and science and theoretical wisdom to the extent that there is that, but practical data, so data that would be the first starting points for practical cognition of what to do or what to will, and then maybe a science of that, or a mastery of that with prudence or virtue, and then again, higher things still with wisdom. Again, pretty tight correlate through the centuries in the medievals, and people have variations, but this is kind of a background working template. And then finally, there's a third part of the soul, which again, the focus on data, science, information direction, theoretically, leaves out not just the practical, but also the productive. And so this was another, not the aspect of the symposium, is arts and technology practitioners in that sense of makers. Where does this go? What's the data for making? What's the initial power or activity of the making? But then isn't there a second, a thing beyond just one make, but like a mastery of it, something at the level of technique? And then could there be still something higher than that, wisdom in relation to arts and technology? Same thing in Kant. This is all just to give you the sense of, we all know this, it's collective wisdom. Okay, so data is defined relationally as what's given to the powers of human intelligence, whichever one they might be, for the realization of some ends. But as the pyramid itself gets right, I think, it's not just these initial ends of the true, the good, the beautiful, the But these higher cultural ends, that's really, we're going towards something bigger. And that's not always heard in the pyramid. It could be like, I have data, I get to wisdom. These higher things like science in general, virtue and justice more general, art and technologies, perfection, and maybe even religion. Okay, so where does algorithm come in? I just wanted to note briefly, again, another thing we don't really talk about, what does it mean, where did it come from? So these process by which the data becomes through human powers to achieve these aims of either individual or cultural orientations. Well, so how does that happen? What's that process? And the answer traditionally is, well, by doing it intelligently, whatever that would mean. So acting in accordance with rules or reasons or ratios or something. And so some of the most elementary rules for this kind of intelligent action or operation are logical rules, and then when you're thinking in relation to quantity, arithmetical rules. So again, the rules aren't part of the data. They're not technically the powers either. They're kind of like the things according to which the powers churn through the data and output stuff by being the powers that they are. So this focus on rules eventually got kind of telescoped in the terminology of algorithm and algebraic methodology through 9th century Persia and the work of, let's see, let's go through. Yeah, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. So this, someone, maybe Lily or Bonnie can tell us, to say this last thing in a way that makes it sound like algorithmy is the root, it's just his, the denomination of this philosopher, mathematician, as to where he's from. In this work, that was, you could see something, 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 again, we'll get someone else to say it properly, but there's a middle word, algebra, which is just translated in Latin is where algebra comes from. So this methodology of focusing on rules, not so much the data, not so much the outputs or the powers, but what is it to act, what are these rules we're acting in accordance with? Okay, translated, oh, you can't see it, but in English it's the book of algebra, and they just keep the al-Muqabala. Okay, quickly, yes, great. So who studies these algorithms? So we're just focusing on this for a moment, just to, again, get to this broader question of this is the process by which data becomes these later things. The rules according to which the powers operate to make data into all the things up the pyramid. So who's studying these rules, or where do these rules come from? We were already noting maybe there's rules for thinking or theorizing. Are there rules for acting or willing? Are there rules for producing in the kind of like making sense? So maybe, for example, in theorizing, the rules of logic, just basic logic. So what about the presentation of these rules itself, this presentation? Will it take the form of a kind of higher science, or will it issue them more like a kind of commands, or will it itself be a technique for figuring out the rules? Who knows? So this, in the mid-centuries, around before Kant, after Kant, up till the 19th century, just even with logic, there was a huge debate. What kind of thing is logic? Is it? So here's one of the most influential ones from Paris: logic as the art of thinking or technique. There's logic where it's rules for the right use of reason, which gives it kind of almost like an ethical characterization. These are commands. And then it might be like medicine, logic. This rule, it's like the rules in medicine. Or eventually, now a lot of people, especially in math and philosophy, talk about it. It's definitely a science. It itself is a science. So if that's right, though, then should there be second-level rules for the presentation of these first-level rules? So we have like a science of science, or maybe a technique of science. You get the kind of iterations. And again, in this last 19th century, there were all of those too. So there's like the logic as not itself the rules for thinking, but it's the rules for thinking about thinking. So it's like the scientia, and different people did ars artium or whatever. Just how can we? Because it's philosophy, you do that kind of thing. But note at the second level, the first level rules or algorithms for the actions or the operations of mind on data to produce culture, and also the ends or values for these activities have themselves now become data in this second level. And so if you're thinking about logic, really on any of the models, the data for logic aren't the normal data. They're the rules according to which the normal data are being processed. So it's kind of a second level thing. So now we could think of this higher culture, so science or whatever, and vary it however you want, mix and match, do this, the matrix. And now we want to know, okay, so data science, where should that go? And then also data, culturing data in the sense of the symposium. Okay, so what are the nature and ends of culture in general? Now we're thinking about this idea of a higher culture, or the reflected culture. So we had this picture classically, but now we can rephrase, so how and why do we culture data, including in this like higher order data science-y high culture way? Why do we do it even at the first level? And then why would we do it at the second level? And then where the algorithms of culture themselves now become the topic or the data for the second level. What are these high ends of any of this? Why are we doing it? Are we really only trying to achieve something of the value of like a true thing, a good thing, satisfying, useful kind of one-off cases? Or at this higher level too, are we trying to get to this perfected, full, complete science, full, complete benevolence, full, complete satisfaction, and maybe full, complete power to the extent that we can get power and have it be under our control? By culturing data at all of these levels, are we still, the highest even, are we still engaged in the classical project of aiming to bring about the perfection of nature, or what the data in and through humanity to thereby realize in some sense like a heaven or utopia on earth? If this is so, where did we get this aim from? I mean, like, where did this come? How did we get off on this project to begin with? Is it just, do we get it from some data? So we have an intuition. Do we have an inclination to do this? We made something like this? Or is it we cognize it, or we deliberately chose it, or we made it a work of art in a creative way, inspiration? Does science tell us that, to do that? Maybe prudence or practical wisdom? Is there like high-level art consciousness that like communes with this highest end? Or do we get it in some sense from something that transcends or lies beyond anything that has ever been actual in nature or in culture or in the history of human spiritual activities, nothing that's really ever been given, like at any of these levels? And so what would that be? So you can see why for some people this goes very quickly towards the religion, and then you could think of the highest culture as kind of opening like a cult out onto this highest values. Okay, so why, if you think of things that way, might that connect with the idea of hope? So this again, Kant, three fundamental questions of philosophy. What can I know? What should I do? For what may I hope? And specifically, what may I hope for the future, given the current imperfect state of knowledge, will, power, art, science, technology, politics, etc.? Everything that's been given so far isn't the perfect. All of the rules according to which we're operating and successfully operating haven't achieved perfection. But we still have this vision of we could still hope for some reason. Why? How? Where does that come from? Now, it's not just, you might think, 19th century or even 18th century, Kant died right at the beginning of the 19th century. The hopes for this kind of connection to immortality or perfection that would be timeless, would transcend all of the imperfect things, maybe even death. This is, I said I would stay in history, so Hannah Arendt is the last history person that we'll mention in the 1950s, has this wonderful book on the human condition, where she's trying to talk through where does this idea of hope still live in the age of massive imperfection, and especially massive imperfection that's brought about specifically by technology and specifically by algorithmically energized hyper-technology like the atomic bomb, and Sputnik is on the first page of her book. Where is hope? Why is it there? But we still feel it. It resonates. What would it be to not just have the mood of algorithms be indicative or useful for theory, they can tell us what's there, or imperative in some sense that like we still will act accordance with them, just maybe we're on machine consciousness at that point. We're just going to keep doing stuff according to these rules, even if we don't really know why in the highest sense. Or is there some way in which the algorithms we have somewhere in there have the mood of being optative, expressing hopes, wishes, desires in that sense, which we really don't have evidence for, that they indicate something that is already given? Obviously they don't. And that we might not even have the power to realize them in some straightforward sense, or else we would have already done it. What is this gap? Where does this go? And what is it pointing to? So the optative is mood grammatically that people don't always talk about, but might be especially important these days. So last set of questions, we'll wrap up. What is the data for or on which we are to base our hopes for something better? Okay. Do they allow for any hope whatsoever? is there anything given, either in the first level data, nature, or second, or whatever, however high up you go, including anything in the already existing algorithms themselves, that's sufficient to let us think, believe, hope, that something more perfect than what's now is really possible? Where does that come from? In what ways has data science in particular shown itself to be a source of hope? Can we imagine new ways of culturing data that would give us more hope still? Here, this is why you can see the end is questions, but we have a ton of people here that hopefully will be able to give us some answers. Okay, the end. Thank you.